All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming on this beautiful day. It feels like summer, doesn't it? Feels like June. I love it. It's exciting to see, you know, the promises of God being fulfilled even in our daily lives, right? God promises that until He comes again, there'll always be seasons and harvests and sowing, and that's why we can hold fast to His promises, because unlike some of the kooks out in the world that think that our earth is going to burn up or something like that, God said that all things will continue until He comes. They'll be eating and drinking and giving in marriage and all those things. So thank God for that. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be good stewards, but that's beside the point. I love this weather. It makes me feel good. All right, let's bow in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your promises, like I mentioned earlier. Thank you so much for promising us that you will return, that you will abolish all evil, all wickedness, that you will redeem your people finally on that last day, that you will return in victory and in glory. Lord, we eagerly anticipate and await that coming of your blessed Son, Jesus Christ. And Lord, as we study your word this morning, help us always realize that as we study these words that were written even thousands of years before Christ, that He is indeed the center. He is the locus of all things in the Bible, and help us apply them to our lives. Help us be strong and steadfast in your word, to always remember that we are part of a cosmological battle that is raging, to not grow complacent, to not be apathetic, to not be distracted, but to instead be focused upon Jesus and be on the right side of you. I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So I wasn't here last week, but I did listen to the class. But of course, I couldn't hear everybody's comments, so I just could hear Lee. So I kind of wanted to do a little bit of a pulse check this morning, because Lee introduced, as we entered into chapter 6 of Genesis, and or chapter 4, I'm sorry. Chapter 4. No, hold on. No, I'm sorry. I'm in the wrong spot. Chapter 6, 1 through 4 of Genesis. He's introducing a cosmological perspective about Genesis 6 that would have been actually what the New Testament writers, as far as we know, and indeed the Second Temple Jews, the Second Temple Jews would have understood as the framework for how they interacted with the spiritual realm. Okay. Oh, well, not just interacted, but how they understood it, the framework by which they understood the spiritual realm. That being, namely, that the angels, as it says in Jude, left the rebellious angels, what we now call demons. The Bene Elohim of the Old Testament, the rebellious ones, left their first estate, corrupted themselves with man, and then during their fall, and then are now ruling the nations with, by God's decree, not by God's decree per se, but by His, He's allowing it temporarily, so that way He can judge them, as it says in Psalm 82, judge the nations, judge the rulers of the nations, including their spiritual overseers who have failed in their duty. Both the principalities and powers that Paul talks about, and also physical rulers, human rulers. So I kind of want to get a pulse check about this, because I know it is hard, and the first time I was introduced to these ideas, they sounded like, you know, those YouTube videos that sometimes pop up where it's like people just kind of pulling verses out of context and really making weird conclusions, you know, about, like, say, flat earth or something. And they pull like one verse out of context and they're like, well, see, this is talking about how the earth is flat and stuff like that and blah, blah, blah. And it's, I know whenever I first encountered this concept of the Nephilim and, you know, what, angels and men somehow, you know, intermarrying or things like that going on, or maybe it's, you know, maybe the angels are just influencing the human. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it is weird. I'm not going to say it isn't weird. It is weird. But it does help explain a lot of other things that are in the Bible that have always confused me. I would read Psalm 82, or I'd read Deuteronomy 32, or I'd read other areas in the Bible, Jude, and even some of the things that Jesus alludes to, and been like, what? What is he talking about? What are these people talking about? I don't understand. So I just kind of want to do a pulse check. Where are you guys at right now? And keep in mind, this is just a perspective. Both Lee and I, even though we do agree on this perspective, both Lee and I are not trying to evangelize for this perspective. We're not trying to force this down your throat, say this is what the leadership at Fairgrounds is, you know, this is what we affirm. This is not a salvific issue. This is not something that, you know, is you know, this is probably a tertiary issue. This isn't even a secondary issue, I think, in terms of whether it affects your faith and stuff like that. It just helps explain some things. And it maybe gives you, in my opinion, it gives us a deeper, more fulfilling and theologically rich understanding of the cosmos. But besides that, I'm not going to hold your feet to the fire and force you or Lee or anybody. It's going to force you to believe one thing or another. If it's just too weird for you, or you find inconsistencies in it or whatever, that's great. So I just wanted to do a pulse check. What are you guys feeling right now about Genesis 6 so far? And we're going to move on from this too. This isn't going to be what we're going to dwell on all the time, but what do you guys think?
Well, it kind of takes those Roman gods of, I don't know, Hercules and Ulysses and all of those out of the fantasy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And same way, then why not Isis, you know, in Egypt? And
Yeah. That is that. Oh, sorry. Oh, I'll get you in one sec. I wanted to say that is actually a very good point, Jane. Because what if, as Paul says, when people were worshiping Zeus or Aphrodite or Isis or things, what if they actually are worshiping a real entity that is evil? Not a powerful God, not a real God, not somebody who actually has God's divine nature, but somebody who is actually malevolently coming alongside pagan nations and perverting them. That's actually a terrifying reality that we may, if that is true, what does that mean about our own culture right now with all the resurgence of demonology? Paganism is on the rise. Have you heard of neo-paganism? Type in neo-paganism in YouTube, just out of curiosity. You will find hundreds of YouTube channels of people saying, no, we need to return to the old gods, blah, blah, blah. I worship Thor, I worship Odin. Sophie and I met somebody on a work trip who worshipped, we asked him, I was like, so what church do you go to, blah, blah, blah. He's like, oh, I'm Norse. And we're like, okay, that's an ethnicity. And he was like, no, I worship the Norse gods. And we're like, oh, okay. So yeah, it's common. It's here.
Yeah, going off of her comment a little bit, I think just entertaining the notion of ancestor worship
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
Just if angels really did take on some kind of fleshly body and then reproduced with humans, you're opening up and they created giants, right? You're opening up the door that these descendants that, had these forbidden knowledges that they were teaching mankind supposedly and stuff were very knowledgeable about hidden systems, and then were also massive and strong compared to normal people. Well, of course you're going to look back at these people that are also long lived, probably outliving some of their descendants. You're going to look back at them and be like, maybe they were part divine or something.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I thought you had a comment. Anybody else have anything? Yeah, I mean, it does help if you if you love studying history like I do. One of the things that is amazing to me is as I study history, it is not a progressive timeline of improvement all the time. There actually seems to have been like around 4,000, or not 4,000, what would that be? Yeah, a little over, like maybe 5,000 years ago-ish, 4,500 years ago or so, there was like this explosion of civilization. There was this, I mean, you have the first Sumerian civilizations, you've got the first Egyptian civilizations, you've got the building of all these, widespread around the world, by the way, pyramidal architecture suddenly just explodes on the scene. Everybody's doing it. And there appears to be this migratory pattern of similar kind of cultural emphases and myths. So half divine, half human, like these godlike kings are almost universal, almost ubiquitous throughout the ancient world. I mean, maybe laying aside like Aboriginal myths or stuff like that, but any place that has civilization as we know it, architecture, writing, law, etc., they almost all have a deep mythos with these half angel or half not half angel, half man, half God kind of mythologies. And so why is that? Why is it almost universal in human history that there's these mythos that came about? Now, it could just be, some other explanation, but it helps, in my opinion, does help explain some of the historical records. But anyways, that's aside the point. It's just an interesting side note. Anybody else have any thoughts? Any problems with it?
Do we, I know one of the things that has been mentioned is it helps explain Deuteronomy 32, Jude, Psalms, all of those, and that Jesus quoted all of that, and that the book of Enoch was found with the Dead Sea Scrolls. But how do we know? Do we know when the book of Enoch was made? Like when the oldest?
Yeah.
Could the book of Enoch have been quoting Jesus and the other things?
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Because
that's our conversation. You asked the temperature of the room or whatever. It's made me want to look into it more, but it also raises some really big, serious questions that I feel like last week, maybe Bertie and Doug kind of just
it's
how
difficult.
God would judge us for the angels and intermeddling and all of that. And it's like the verse, to me, it's like there could be two things true at once. Kind of what you described of the angels being involved, the fallen angels, how we see as demons now maybe, could be involved in earthly things more than we realize and all of that. But those verses specifically that we pull out to be that they intermarried and all of that, like going from the perspective of those were more people following God, like sons of God, going through that definition that they were just people. So that comment of, and there were giants in those days, it's like, could that also just mean there were giants in those days. Like a passing comment of like this happened long enough ago. Like that's when giants were, because we know pre-flood we have the fossil evidence that things were bigger.
Oh, everything.
So it's like, could people have just been bigger? You know, and that was a passing comment of this happened long ago, all of that. And so it's like, but do you know when, like, what were the oldest manuscripts of the Enoch and all of those?
So we do know, I'd have to look into it a little bit more, but I have before, but I just don't remember off the top of my head. But I'm pretty, oh, sorry, Ryan. But I'm pretty.
I was just going to say, I think if I'm remembering, like, if I'm recalling correctly, because I have a lot of spare time with my new job. Anyways, and I happen to, because of the study, derail for a little bit on YouTube while at work. I think if I'm recalling correctly, the oldest one they can determine based off the Dead Sea Scrolls was about 400 BC.
Yeah, right, Yes, so that's what I was going to say is from what I remember, Enoch, and there's first Enoch and there's second Enoch. And so I think the earliest versions of Enoch we're pretty certain were probably written during the intertestamental period. They were probably written or during, like, right after the Babylonian exile, or maybe even the earliest, like, oral traditions that were being passed on were kind of formulated during the Babylonian captivity. And then they were passed on and added to and stuff. And I don't think, we don't need, like kind of what Lee said last week, we don't need to accept that Enoch is actual scripture. It's just a historical reference, okay? It's just a historical reference point. It'd be like us quoting Josephus or something, you know what I mean? That doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. That doesn't mean that it's God-inspired or anything like that. It's just an interesting parallel that helps us understand how people were thinking and talking about these topics of the day. So it'd be like us finding a newspaper, you know, of the 1950s and seeing how people are interpreting the Korean War or something, right? Kind of in that vein. That's how I think of it. At least because there's also, especially in Second Enoch, there's some really weird stuff, and it's also written in an apocryphal. Thank you, apocryphal manner. So it's, you know, and it's also apocalyptic. That's the word I'm looking for. It's an apocalyptic literature, so much like Revelation or stuff. So there's a lot of symbolism and metaphor and things like that in there. So anyways, so it's just an interesting perspective. But like I said, what is the kind of what you alluded to, Elena? So what are the theological implications? What are the soteriological implications? What are the Christological implications? This is kind of where it interests me, because then things like Jesus ascending Mount Hermon and being transfigured and things like that, and some of the things he said around that area maybe hold a little bit more theological weight now, because now we understand kind of the symbology behind it. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything, like I said, reiterating, everything that Enoch said or what the ancient Jews believed during the intertestamental period or the Second Temple Judaism doesn't mean they were 100% right. But it does give us a better perspective of how they viewed the world. They viewed the world through a deeply spiritual, they viewed the world as deeply enchanted. And I don't mean that in a voodoo kind of way. What I mean is they saw world powers and even local powers and princes and principalities as reflective of a deeper spiritual reality. And this is thoroughly mapped out throughout the Bible. I mean, there are so many examples of this. We can turn to Daniel. I think did Lee already talk about that in Daniel, where Michael held up by the prince of. Yeah, okay. So there's examples throughout the Bible of this deeper spiritual reality that's almost going on behind the scenes. But it has effects upon our world. It doesn't mean we don't have power or agency. Doesn't eliminate our free choices. It doesn't mean that we're not free moral agents. Nothing like that. The devil, as I think was Lee last week, the devil made me do it. No, you cannot use that excuse. You cannot say that, oh, the devil made me do it. No, maybe the devil or his minions influenced you, just like they did with Adam and Eve, but what's new? They've been doing that since the beginning. They've been trying to subvert humanity and divert our course towards union with God by cutting us off at the knees whenever possible, or by dangling temptations in front of us, or attacking us, or even, as we see during Jesus' day, literally possessing people. And I do believe that still happens today. I'll just go out there and say it. I do believe that still happens. I think people need to be careful with attributing that. And I think there's certain preconditions that need to be in place for that to occur. But I do believe it still happens. But anyways, anybody else have any comments about the study thus far? I think one of the things that was raised last time was, well, if there's these angel-human hybrids, or maybe the angels were possessing people and then using some kind of, divine knowledge or supernatural knowledge to orchestrate, bloodlines or something. Who knows? However they were involved, whether spiritually or physically. What does that mean about their progeny? Do their progeny, say you were born a half angel human hybrid, or say you were, a giant, a Nephilim. Say you were a Nephilim. Does that mean you were just born evil and you had no choices? Well, if that was true, if it is true that it happened, they would still be free moral agents, because they are the result of two moral agents who have freedom. So angels can make choices. Humans can make choices, so you're still a moral agent. At least that's where I would come to that, because I heard a question, I didn't hear the answer and stuff for it. But that's how I've come to think about it. I could be wrong about that. I could be leaving something out, but yeah. Oh, here, hold on. Sorry.
That was kind of part of my question: are they still made in the image of God? So that was kind of my rabbit trail. Is if their genetics haven't been wiped out, are they still in the world today? Genetics of this mixture, and are they still in the image of God? Are they still needing to be saved? That kind of is my rabbit trail.
Yeah, I would say, I keep grabbing the mic like I have one. I would say, ultimately, we don't know. There's a lot here that's not explained, and there's a lot of things that are just conjecture, and I admit that. Like, 90% of this, for me, is just conjecture. I don't know. But I will say this, that's a really good question. If they are still the children of God, well, again, it kind of goes back to what I just said about being free moral agents. Angels and men are both free moral agents. If they're both if angels are Bene Elohim, sons of God, and we are children of God, for their progeny, I don't know. This is all speculation.
He destroyed him with the flood.
Yeah. Well, that is what we do know. Is that Noah and his progeny were saved, were the only ones saved. So, I don't know. And also begs the question of what about after the flood? Because we see Nephilim again and Raphaim and others giants being described in the Old Testament. We don't know. We don't know how they came about. There's some speculations, about Noah's, maybe Noah's sons, wives had that genetic strain. That's speculation, unverifiable, don't know. We also, I think it's not outside the realm of possibility because there are some things that are kind of hinted of. For instance, in Sodom and Gomorrah, about the men desiring strange flesh. Maybe it's not just talking about homosexuality. It might be talking about how they actually were, the men of Sodom and Gomorrah, or the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were deeply interested in reestablishing that angel-human relationship. I don't know. But there could be some attempts by Satan and his minions to, kind of reintroduce this this concept of, hey, if you worship us, we'll somehow, continue this hybridization. I don't know. But they failed at it, and God sent in the Israelites to wipe out the giants, and then they also just died off over time and stuff because mankind wasn't united like it was before the flood of one language and one culture. I don't know. It's all speculation.
And there's other things that come into it. I mean, we as Americans are taller, bigger, and it's your lifestyle, the food you eat, the things you do, and over hundreds and thousands of years, it makes a difference.
Yeah.
Maybe there was some great fruit that made you grow tall.
Yeah, maybe those grapes. Yeah. Also, the other possibility too is just like what you just said, Doug. Is maybe the pre-flood genetics of longer lifetimes and the genetics of being larger and everything like that. Maybe that carried on through some of the people groups, and it was all just natural giants. There was no spiritual component to it at all. We don't know. And like I said, we're not again, Lee and I are not planting this flag and saying you have to abide by this worldview. We're just saying this is just an interesting perspective that helps explain some other things in the Bible a little bit better.
Andrew?
Yeah.
I think, the genetics of it is all speculation, obviously. But just a little bit later in chapter 6 and verse 13, when God says to Noah, the end of all flesh, I am prepared to end flesh. Mm-hmm. And I think that might be the key, is that whatever happened here, what remained was still the flesh in opposition to the spiritual.
Yes.
And so whatever the genetics are, what we know is that God was prepared. He defined it as flesh, and he was prepared to destroy it.
Yeah.
But he allowed it to continue through Noah's line. And so whatever we have today is flesh.
Yeah.
And then that's consistent with all the parallels and comparisons that happen spiritual flesh from that time forward. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure that speculation is particularly important.
No.
Because we can say with confidence what existed was fleshly.
Yeah.
And flesh is in opposition to the spiritual. It was then and it is now.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I wanted to go. Thank you, because that's kind of good segue to where I wanted to go is whatever your perspective, that is actually what is the theological significance of these verses in chapter 6 and proceeding with Noah, is Noah was blameless in all his generations. It says that in verse, where is that? Verse 9. Well, going back up, let's just go verse 5. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That is some dramatic language. Like, even in other places in the Bible, it's like where God is condemning wickedness or whatever, he doesn't say that. In some cases, he doesn't say that people are only ever imagining evil. It's more like, oh, they've become slothful in all their ways, and they need to acknowledge me. But he's condemning their behaviors. But here, it's like you kind of get the implication being that as evil as people are, like even some evil, like an evil thug or a murderer still loves his mama. You know what I'm saying? Whereas here it's like only wicked continually. There is nothing good in any of man's even thoughts and imaginations. I can't even imagine that level of depravity. What we do know is today, there are a lot of things that God has put in place to prevent that from happening totally. One of them being the church is in the world. So that's one reason. We're salt and light. We're a leavening influence on our culture and societies and civilizations. But besides that, having multiple languages, having multiple cultures, a diffusion of power, if you will, multiple nations, has helped kind of, keep humanity from completely going down that path. But before the flood, it was not like that. Mankind had one language, one culture. They must have been ruled by a tyrant of some kind. We don't know. But there must have been some locus power, some focus of power that existed. And with these satanic entities or these demonic entities at the top. So we know that whatever happened, genetically or spiritually, whatever, the evil spiritual realm, the bad seed of the Nakash, was the dominating force on the world, except for Noah and his family. And I think that is incredible. I can't even imagine. Can you imagine living in a world where you can't trust anybody ever? That they're always perpetually out for their own gain. They're always killing each other, because he says that the violence was widespread. Always killing each other, perverting things. I'm sure it was just the amount of sexual immorality and everything else going on. The perverseness was so bad that God said that it repented him in verse 6. Repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. So here, that I've heard and even, kind of wondered myself, like, he's perfect in all his generations. Maybe that's kind of talking about his genetics. That's not in the context here. The context is that he is righteous, that he alone is righteous. And he has preserved righteousness through his generations, or his family has. And now there could be repercussions, or not repercussions, what's the word I'm looking for? There could be some assumptions we can make about that. If everybody else is becoming perverted with angels and stuff like that, he hasn't. I don't know. But all that being said, he was righteous. He followed God. He walked with God. He was steadfast. Even in the midst of all this wickedness around him, he was steadfast and did not waver. What an amazing example for us, right? What a Christ-like figure he is. He's an example. He's like an antitype or a type of Christ in this passage, because in the midst of a perverse and evil generation, he has stood steadfast and does the will of God, just like how Jesus did. Except Jesus did it actually perfectly, because I'm sure Noah still sinned, but he relied upon God for his salvation. Because it says Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. God showed Noah grace, which means that Noah needed it. But Noah was orientated towards the seed of the seed of the woman that would come. Everybody else was orientated towards the seed of Satan. I can imagine just how wicked and how hard that must have been for Noah. Or how wicked other people were and how hard that must have been for Noah. And it says in verse 10 that Noah begat 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The earth, and then it goes back to describing how evil the earth was. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. So, again, this is speculation. I don't know this to be true. But if there was some kind of B'nai Elohim influence upon the earth, it stands to reason that if once they perverted humanity, whether spiritually or physically or both, once they perverted humanity, they would then set their target on everything else, all flesh. What do we see today? Where's a parallel to that today that I think is actually kind of scary? I'm sorry?
In Africa, where they have the rebels, they own nothing. They destroy. They take and build nothing. They just destroy.
Oh, you're talking about like the Boko Haram and stuff like that? Yeah, oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, we see violence for sure on the earth everywhere. What I think of is, what scares me, I should say, is all this genetic manipulation that is going on in our culture. Not just in our culture, but around the world. I just heard about, Nathan told me about this, in the Wuhan lab that coronavirus spread from, which we now know wasn't fake news, was true, been verified, that that same lab is developing a virus that has a 40 to 70% mortality rate or something like that.
Taking that virus, I forget the name of it, but it's a 40 to 75% fatality rate when infecting people. And they're putting it in mosquitoes. They're shooting those mosquitoes with radiation to make them infertile.
Yeah, infertile.
Releasing those mosquitoes in that case to try to combat disease-carrying bats.
Yeah, right. So essentially, and that's not. Yeah, to basically what they're doing is to use bats as biological hosts and carriers for genetically modified mosquitoes or whatever. So this is where when are we just playing God? When are we just playing God with our medical technology, with genetics, with all these things, where we are fusing, hybridizing things with other species, cross-species stuff, where we're taking one kind of animal and mixing it with another kind of animal's genetics to try and, perfect the genetic strain. I don't know. I think there's a lot of danger there. I think it's a hubris of humanity to think that we can possibly understand all things and have all this. And I know there's exceptions to that. And I know there's genetic therapies and things like that help people who are sick, and I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about things that are good. I'm talking about the perversion of kinds. The hubris. Right, yeah. Jared? Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So you can think things and become bad. Do anything and make it bad, and so you can just read the Epstein files, just a little bit of them, and you'll realize that man is completely evil and wicked. So, I mean, that doesn't surprise me that they're doing it in a lab still. They were already, and have been for a long time.
Yeah, nothing's new under the sun, right?
Hey, Andrew.
Yeah.
I think it might be just a touch more refined. We tend to think of it as people becoming God. But when people don't believe in God, they're not trying to become God.
No.
So when you eliminate the moral authority, you also eliminate consequences.
Right.
When you eliminate consequences, you eliminate any consideration of unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the arrogance and hubris comes. It's when you acknowledge a moral law and a moral lawgiver, it actually creates humility because of an acknowledgement of consequences.
Right.
When consequences go away, everything else that follows them goes away as well.
Yeah.
And so we tend to think, well, they're trying to become God. They're not trying to become God.
No.
They're simply, whatever their moral yes is, that rationalizes whatever they're doing, which is really hard for us to, as a concept. And I think that's, like, how we think about it is important because we're actually, that's the fight. The fight is, no, there is a God. He is a moral lawgiver, which creates a moral law that we're bound to. But that abandonment of any consideration of unintended consequences, I think, is what we're seeing in what you're describing across the board.
Yeah, and that goes back to what I was saying about. Oh, sorry, Doug, you got something? I don't know which way to go. There.
One thing we'll keep in mind is Satan can create nothing, and Ben Elohim can create nothing.
Right.
But they can corrupt. What God creates for good, they can corrupt for their own purpose of rebellion. And that's really easy to imitate. For humans, humans can imitate rebellion and corruption. Humans can imitate righteousness and creativity, or create, the ability to actually create instead of just being creative. There's creativity is just manipulation.
Right.
And that's what Satan's a master of. And I think that's where all flesh followed that pattern. But Noah was content with God's creation.
Yeah.
And his way.
Yeah. And I think, again, that's the primary theological implication here is Noah did not trust in the technique of the people around him. He trusted in God's law. He trusted in God's way, not in the perfection of or not the perfection, the degradation of all flesh that was around him. And that's my primary point I wanted to make is anytime you hear something in the news, anytime there's anytime there is a emphasis from the culture around us, or even our neighbors, anybody, people in power, for us to just trust us. Trust us. We know what we're doing. We have become wise. We are now the ones who are the enlightened ones, or whatever. We're the specialists. Trust us. But what they're saying is going against God's law. We have to be like Noah. We have to be like Noah and trust in God's ways and not trust in the perfection of technique, in the perfection of whatever is being touted as the way forward, but it's actually a perversion. So then God said unto Noah, and he warns him, and he says, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So I find this kind of ironic there. It's like all these earthly, like Dad used that, these earthly, carnal, fleshly rebels that are in existence before the flood, they're putting their faith in things of the earth and things of flesh. What is God going to use to destroy them? The earth itself. He's not going to just snap his fingers and they all just drop dead and only Noah and his progeny are left. He could have. He could have just done that. He could have just been like, oh, okay, you're all dead. Starting over with Noah. He used the earth itself to punish those who had fallen from their first estate, come to the earth, and made the earth their idol, made the earth and the perversion of it their goal. He's going to say, nah, I still have dominion over that earth. That earth is not going to be your realm. That earth is still my realm, and I'm going to use it to destroy you and start over. I find that's interesting, to me at least. He says, make thee an ark of gopher wood, rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. And I think, how much time we got left? About 5 minutes? Okay. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make it of. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make to the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above, and the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof, with lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it. So one point I wanted to point out here. There are a lot of flood stories. There's a lot of flood myths, not only in Mesopotamia region, but around the world. There are flood myths in China. There's flood myths in Native American tribes. There's flood myths in European tribes. There's flood myths in Africa. There's flood myths in Indonesia. I already said China. Australia, Japan. So it is a universal myth. Now, the difference, though, is all those other myths, they don't actually get into the engineering. They don't get into the specifics about the ark. They'll say, oh, it was a round tub, or it was a wicker basket, or it was a canoe, a giant canoe, or it was, there's almost like this loss of memory from all these other human tribes over the ages. But they still retain the core memory, but they've just kind of added their own cultural emphases to it. But with this, it's no myth. God is giving like specific directions and engineering like measurements and dimensions that even today would make a very, very seaworthy vessel to withstand high winds and being buffeted by tumultuous seas. Yeah.
So, for instance, the naval engineering portion of the Navy, the dimensions of the ark is the perfect buoyancy pattern for a boat.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you make a ship out of metal,
Yep.
wood, those dimensions scaled up or down to the size of the vessel is the perfect buoyancy.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you didn't hear that, Doug's saying it's the perfect buoyancy dimensions for that. So that's what I'm saying is the engineering, the specifics of it are so interesting to me. That God is so, and what's the theological implication? God gives us all the directions we need to endure whatever is to come. He gives us the ark of our salvation through Jesus Christ to endure the destruction that is to come. And we'll expand on that more, and we'll talk more about the Christ-centric aspect of these verses next time. Thank you. That's all right. How are you doing?